ferocious fighting is happening over here. The terrorists are responding with sniper fire. The Syrian army is striking the positions of the terrorists over here increasingly in order to advance towards Douma and Eastern Ghouta. One tank finishes its job, the other starts another mission. This is how things are going like over here in Eastern Ghouta. Here, the army personnel are giving signs of victory. Before heading for striking the terrorists in the farms and orchards of Eastern Ghouta, particularly around Douma. The army is continuously striking those areas, and the aim, of course, is to defeat terrorist organizations here.
The Syrian regime has stepped up its offensive in Eastern Ghouta. The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights says that more than 800 people have been killed in the latest bombardment and hundreds more wounded. In Geneva, UN war crimes investigators released a report on the situation in the Damascus suburb.
Next month, the brutal siege of Eastern Ghouta will be entering its fifth year. I repeat, fifth year. Pro-government forces are using starvation as a method of warfare against the hundreds of thousands of civilians.
The UN says an international aid convoy was forced to turn back on Monday due to a lack of safety.
As a result, 14 of the 46 trucks in the convoy were not able to fully offload critical humanitarian supplies.
The World Health Organization has criticized the removal of medical supplies from aid trucks.
No justification has been received from the Syrian authorities regarding the removal or reduction of the supplies.
The UN says children have been the hardest hit by the war, with nearly 2 million of them in need of urgent assistance across Syria.
The first 2 months of this year have been especially bloody for children. We have received reports of over 1,000 children who were killed and seriously injured in the whole Syria only since the year began.
Families in Eastern Ghouta have appealed for help as food runs out in the Damascus suburb, with the elderly and children most affected. The UN says another aid convoy will be sent to the region on Thursday if the security improves. For many desperate families, that is too long a wait.
Well, the Syrian army has made significant gains in its fight against militants in Eastern Ghouta. Our correspondent Zahra Al-Durzi is in the battlefield and has filed this report.
On the southeastern edge of Eastern Ghouta, the Syrian army has liberated the town of al-Muhammadeya. This follows the liberation of Beit Naim and El Ab farms, where Nusra Front and other terrorist groups' defense lines are. The Syrian army has liberated 37 square kilometers of the terrorist-held territories since February 25th and is advancing rapidly toward major militant strongholds of Douma, Irbin and Harasta.
Syrian army continue targeting al-Nusra Front positions in the enclaved Eastern Ghouta. Fierce battles between the Syrian army and Nusra Front terrorists are taking place right now in the town of al-Muhammadeya, and we are standing on the outskirts of al-Muhammadeya inside the Eastern Ghouta.
We have taken control of Muhammadeya, and still advancing Nusra terrorists are collapsing, and the operation will continue till the liberation of the whole area.
The Press TV team toured the newly liberated areas like Nashabiya, which was one of the strongholds of the militant group Jaish al-Islam.
Every day the Syrian army keeps advancing. The battle for Eastern Ghouta is a fierce battle. They have been fortified and supported by Zionism. We advance and defeat them.
The Syrian army is now advancing toward Al-Rihan village after the Syrian army took Al-Shifuniya town and cut the supply lines into Al-Rihan. The newly liberated Al-Shifuniya is the gate to Douma, which is locally considered as the capital of Eastern Ghouta. From Eastern Ghouta, Zahra Al-Derzi, Press TV.
The Syrian army makes fresh gains in its battle against terrorist groups in Eastern Ghouta. Government forces have fully recaptured the districts of al-Muhammadeya village, east of the country's capital. Sources on the ground say a Syrian army now controls over 40% of Eastern Ghouta. The army has been trying to dislodge terrorist groups, including the al-Nusra Front members, from the area. The militant-held region is located just 10 kilometers from Damascus city center. Terrorists holed up there have been using the area as a launch pad to attack the Syrian capital. Meanwhile, a 46-truck convoy carrying aid for residents of Eastern Ghouta has arrived there. This is the first aid delivery to the region in weeks. Let's speak to Kevin Barrett. He's an author and Middle East expert, and he joins us via Skype from Madison. Many thanks for joining us here on Press TV, Mr. Barrett. Now, the Syrian army is making steady gains against these terrorist groups on the ground in Eastern Ghouta. The U.S., though, or its Western allies, are not calling this liberation, though, are they?
No, of course not. They are playing an obstructionist role. They're trying to be the spoilers, and they're trying to keep the chaos going and the destabilization continuing as long as possible, because they know they've lost. At this point, there's no chance that their mantra of Assad must go will carry the day, and they know that. Assad will stay, and Syria will evolve from a stable platform, beginning with the current government. So they're trying to essentially punish the Syrian people and it's the backers of the Syrian government as much as possible by creating as much trouble as they can as the situation in Syria stabilizes. So it's quite ridiculous, the hypocrisy that we're seeing from some Western observers now, as they're crying crocodile tears over the suffering of the civilians, which is very real. It is indeed sad that people are suffering, but that suffering will be ending before too long as Syria regains control over its territory and gets its sovereignty back after this orchestrated attempt from external actors led by the United States, Israel, Saudi Arabia, other Gulf countries, and to some extent Turkey, to take down the Syrian government and break up Syria into pieces, which is the ultimate purpose of this, led by the Israelis. They've failed. So now they're just trying to extract as much blood and pain and treasure from the other side as possible, even though they're admitting essentially that they've lost.
Right now, Mr. Barrett, there's also that, as far as perceptions are concerned, or that media campaign when it comes to Syria, particularly right now as we're seeing in Eastern Ghouta. Now, there's very little mention in the Western media about this 46-truck convoy carrying aid for residents in Eastern Ghouta coming, or the fact that humanitarian corridors were set up upon which these terrorists have been not allowing civilians to use to flee to safety. And at the same time, there is very little mention of the terrorist groups like the al-Nusra Front who are actually operating in Eastern Ghouta.
It is interesting, isn't it, that we have an entire narrative of contemporary Western civilization that's built on the demonization of al-Qaeda and this kind of extremism, this Wahhabi-linked extremism. And yet, this is precisely the current that's dominant in Ghouta, and yet we're getting this New York Times, New York Review of Books-led narrative that this is somehow comparable to the suffering in Srebrenica and similar situations. And of course, the reason for this is that the controlled propaganda media here in the West doesn't want people to understand the big picture. They simply want to demonize whoever is standing up against the empire. In this case, that would be the current Syrian government. So Al-Qaeda is the objective ally of the United States and its Israeli masters. It's very sad. And as far as this humanitarian convoy goes, it is questionable who's actually obstructing it. They're trying to blame the Syrian government. The Syrian government helped set up the corridors. These convoys, to some extent, have been shelled, and these terrorists, because that's what they are shelling Damascus randomly. That's terrorism, randomly targeting civilians, and they appear to be responsible to some extent for hindering this aid from actually getting through. And like you said, they are holding the civilians captive as human shields, essentially, which is a crime under international law. So there's plenty of blame to go around on all sides here, but the bottom line is that the people, any Syrians who joined this foreign effort to destabilize their country made a terrible, terrible mistake. And it's time for everybody to recognize that the outcome of this is clear, and we need to finish it up with as little suffering and violence as possible. It's really time for the rebels to take advantage of the offers coming out of the Syrian government for rejoining Syrian society. Syria needs to heal, and the West needs to butt out.
Okay, that's Kevin Barrett, author and Middle East expert, joining us via Skype from Madison. Mr. Barrett, thank you very much indeed for your comments here on Press TV.